In this video, we're going to look at bleeds and why we use bleeds, setting things up for print in Illustrator. We could also set things up, obviously, in Photoshop and InDesign. Normally, we don't set up bleeds in Photoshop. InDesign and Illustrator are our layout programs, InDesign being more of our layout program, but we can set them up in Illustrator as well. But first, we have to understand why we even use bleeds or what bleeds are. Let's start with a new document. I'm going to go through this document a little bit later, step by step, to really understand some of the issues with bleeds and some of the technical issues we're going to come across. So I'm just going to start a new file here, Command N or File New, and just an 8.5 by 11, which is fine, but we do see the word bleed, and we need to kind of see what we can do with that. So what we do by default, there are certain specs for the bleed that you'll always use over and over and over again. And if you have anything that is 11 by 17 tabloid or smaller, usually we're going to keep it at 0.125 inches, so 1/8 of an inch. Anything above that, that's slightly bigger than that or even bigger, we're going to have 1/4 of an inch. So we're going to say it's 0.25. And that gives the printer a little bit extra space when we're talking about cutting things up and making sure they fit properly on the paper. But we're going to talk about that in just a second. So because this one's 8.5 by 11, I'm going to have 1/8 of an inch, 0.125 inches, and I'm good to go. I'm just going to say create. And what that does in Illustrator, the way it looks here is, okay, obviously the white space is the artboard. It has a little black line around it. That's the artboard. Then I'm going to have this red line around this area here. And I see that, wait, this is a little thinner, this is a little thicker. So I must have messed something up, and that's okay. What I can do to fix that, I'm going to File, Document Setup, and then I'm just going to fix that. So yeah, I obviously didn't have the link on, so now they're all going to all be the same, 0.125, and I'll say okay. So there we go. So now everything's the same. So the red line is our bleed line. Well, what's that mean? Well, what you have to do is use that bleed line to extend things, items, objects on the artboard past the artboard edge and to the bleed line. So if I have something like this, and now when I do this, when I'm talking about this, I mean strictly we're talking about print production. When you're making things for the web, you don't have to worry about bleed. That's not an issue. We're only talking about bleed when we're putting ink on a paper, and then part of that ink, part of that area has to get cut off. And what the bleed does for us, it allows us to have edge-to-edge ink coverage. And that's what we want. So I'm just going to get rid of this fill, this stroke. I'm going to add a fill. So there's my fill. And right now, if I was going to send this to print, this would be incorrect. It would not be right. The printer would say, you have to use the bleed. Show me the bleed. So the way we would do that, instead of resting something on the edge, any edge of the artboard or the paper, we need to extend it to the bleed, bring it to the red line. Now we have a bleed where this will get cut off. This little area here is going to get cut off, and I'm going to have edge-to-edge ink coverage. So if I can fill this whole thing up with that, that is great, and there's going to be a bleed on there. If I only shrink it down that it's only going to cover the edge, that's no good. Especially for print, you're going to have to set up a bleed because something is going to happen when you send it to print and they start cutting it up. So let me go to this file and show you what I'm talking about. So the issue is this. So right now, these are the bleed problems. Normally, I'm going to look at this. Let's pretend this is a printed piece. It's finished. It's done. It was printed on paper. This is what I got. Perfect. It looks great. Edge-to-edge ink coverage. I love it. Very happy with that. This is what can happen if we do not use a bleed. Look what's happening here. See this little white gap, this white line? And see this one down here, this white line here, and maybe even another one over here? And see how this one's kind of off kilter a little bit? It's a little rotated? Well, that's what could happen. So when you send something to print and it does not have a bleed, what could happen to it is that they're stacked pieces of paper together, and when they go through a guillotine or a paper cutter, they get cut, and sometimes those papers shift. They move a little bit. So what the bleed affords us is an area that it can move a little bit. It's allowed to move a little bit, and it actually can slightly rotate even, and there's still enough bleed to make it work, where the black area, this black line, is still covered with ink. So that's the idea behind the bleed. Because the way it works is this. When you send let's pretend this is a flyer. We're getting a flyer printed, and we're sending it to the printer just as it's 8.5 by 11, very simple. And the way the printer actually sets it up, they don't print an 8.5 by 11 sheet and just cut it. No, they put many up on one larger piece of paper and then cut it. And that's why we need these trim marks So the printer can see where they actually cut. These are little cut lines that they make. In Illustrator, it's called trim marks. In InDesign, they're called crop marks. It means the same thing. So they would actually come with their paper cutter and cut all the way down here, and they would cut all the way across this way, and cut, and what would happen, these little thin strips of ink would be cut off, leaving your proper 8.5 by 11 sheet, proper dimensions, with full edge-to-edge ink coverage. So that's why we need to set up our bleed properly and make sure our trim marks are on there and everything. So let me show you some of the correct and incorrect ways we do these things. So this is the incorrect way. What some of you would do is you'd create this flyer, potentially, and you would say, okay, I just made this really quickly for the short hills, and I just made this background photograph. I put some type on there, this circle. I just played around with some type. Well, all of it sits on the edge of the paper or the artboard, but we can consider it the paper, and that's not good. Now, if this was for web, this would be totally fine. We don't need bleed for the web, but for the print, we do. So what I need to do is extend the picture to the bleed. I need to extend this circle past the bleed. I need to extend this bottom piece that is actually also not extended to the bleed, extended to the bleed. And there I go. Now that's correct. So if I look at it this way, this one is correct. Everything extends to the bleed, or actually past the bleed, which is fine. And I'm looking good there. Everything's looking good. However, there was an issue over here, wasn't there? What I did here, I just like made it bigger so it actually covers the bleed area. Here, well, I don't want to actually size up the circle. I like the way the circle is, but what I do need to do is cover this little area with this same color, the same flat color, which I did just by making a quick little square, or I could use the pen tool and just make a little random shape that fits as well too. And that's what we can do, but once again, I've done down here. Instead, I just increase the size of the circle, and that works as well. So that way, circles can be a little bit tricky, and you might find other objects a little tricky, but as long as it fills in that little pocket there, that little bleed area, you're fine. Okay, so that's how we actually correct our issues with bleed. If there's anything sitting on the edge that doesn't need to be, it should be extended to the bleed line. That's how we do it, just extend things, okay? Now, here's an issue where actually I don't need a bleed. I don't need to show a bleed because I have a white border. A white border, if that's used, you do not need to have a bleed. So all this space around here, it doesn't matter because I have a white border in between my paper edge and the bleed, and what that now provides me is this safety area where I could put things, and certain things get cut off a little bit, which is fine because I've prepared my artwork in a particular way, a certain way that works well. And now because of this white border, there is no bleed. There's no need for a bleed. So looking at that further, what I did in this particular situation, I actually made a bunch of white rectangles and put them on the board. Now, this is one way to do it. It's not the best way to do it because, well, I don't know how thick those are and if it's going to be enough space. So what I do need to do is set up my margins. Now, setting up margins, or what we call the safety, is a way to make sure that the important information that is on your flyer or any printed piece actually won't get cut off. So in this situation, I made a margin of 1/8 of an inch. That's all you really need. So 1/8 of an inch bleed and 1/8 of an inch safety margin is enough to make sure we're going to be okay there. So once again, nothing extends to the bleed here because I have my white border, and that's just enough. Now, if I go a little too far, let's pretend I bring this out a little bit further. That's actually not bad because it's white too, but let's pretend it wasn't white. Let's pretend it was this color. And now if I go a little too far here, you see here and here, this is definitely going to get cut off. This actually might get cut off, even though it seems, well, I'm still far away from the paper edge. Well, remember, when the paper gets cut, it might shift, it might change. This could get cut off. And if you don't want that to get cut off, well, you better bring it back inside the safety. Don't let it go past the safety. Okay, that's just for important information. As opposed to, well, you know, this picture, it doesn't matter if this little rock gets cut off or if this little area gets cut off, that's okay. But important information like this should be within the safety. If it's here, that's fine. If it's here, that's okay. If you get a little too close, maybe that's not good. that is definitely not good. You have to be careful, okay? So you can get close to the edge, close to your safety, but if you set it up, that's the best way to do it. So there's two ways to set up the safety, which I'm going to show you. The one I don't recommend, but it is one way to do it. I at least want to show you. What I'm going to do, I'm going to open up my rulers, and by doing that, I just press Command R, and I can toggle them off, Command R again, or I'll just go to View, Rulers, and I could, like I said, show them or hide them. And there are my rulers are going to be on, and what I can do, I can actually click and drag this imaginary line to my artboard, and look what happens. I'm just going to drop it right there, and look, I made a guide. And I could do that again right here. I'm going to make another one. Now to measure it out perfectly, that's why I don't love this. It's a little trickier. It can be done, and I'm just dragging out lines to make my safety area. I'm kind of using this as a guide too to help me, and I'm just clicking and dragging. All right, there we go. So now my safety is met, and quite frankly, if I copied all this, brought it down here, and there I go. It actually works out pretty good, but not the best way to do it. Another way to use the rulers too, really, if you wanted to, is actually you could just double click. So my 0 point is set up here. I could actually just double click right here. Oh, on the ruler, and it sets it up for me. If I double click over here, it'll set it up for me. So let me actually just get rid of these. I went a little too far back. There we go. Okay, I'm going to click here. There, I set it up. I'm going to click here, and it sets it up. Now, I don't recommend that way. Once again, if you double click on the ruler, it also works, just like clicking and dragging them out. Like I said, I don't like the way that works. This gives you actually a little bit more precision when you double click on the certain area that you're going to line it up, but I don't like that. This is the way I prefer to do it, is to drag out a rectangle. So I'm going to click on my rectangle tool, and I'm going to double click. Double click anywhere in the artboard or the workspace, it doesn't matter, and I know that my file, my artboard, is 8.5 by 11. But I also know, if I look back up here, this is 1/8 of an inch, this is 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, and the top is 1/8 of an inch. Well, 0.125 plus the top 0.125 is 0.25. So I'm going to subtract 0.25 from 8.5. And I'm also going to do the same thing with the sides. And I'm going to get rid of the 11 and make it 10.75. So I'm just subtracting 0.25 from both of those. And now I have my safety rectangle, and I'm just going to align it to this artboard. This is chosen. I could tell the artboard is chosen because it has the black line around it. And now I'm just going to align. I could use the control panel if you don't have it open, window and control. Or I can go to my align panel. Once again, if you don't have it open, window and align. And I can just center and center. And just to be on the safe side, make sure it's aligned to artboard, or down here, aligned to artboard. And now it's perfectly aligned. Well, I also don't want it to move either. So what I can do is go to View, Guides, and lock the guides. And now it won't move, it can't move. I can still select it. It is on a layer, but right now that's my safety. Awesome. I'm going to select that, copy, put that in here. Nice. And now I have my safety on as well. Okay? And I can see that my guides are in place, and I have this nice margin, this nice safety area that's going to help me out. So that's how we set up our safety. That's the best way to do it, to make sure your important information stays within the safety area and will not get cut off. Okay, now if we look at this kind of another issue some people have problems with. I just want to cover some of these. So right now I have this image. Well, I really like this image, but I don't want it to cover the whole thing. I just want a part of it. But maybe I have another artboard here, and this is getting in the way. Okay, that's not a problem. Really what we could also use is Trim View. You go to View and Trim View. And what Trim View does is actually just gets rid of everything that's off of the artboard. You can't see it anymore. And that's really, it's a kind of a nice preview that we could use. But it still might get in the way, and there's a couple other things. Like, I don't mind that this is there, but that waterfall, I kind of wanted to see that waterfall. This isn't the best part of the picture. So what you could also do is use a clipping mask. Clipping mask is very easy to use, and it keeps your whole area really nice and clean if you like that. It doesn't have to be a perfect workspace, but you can make it nice. So what you can do here is actually make a clipping mask. And let me show you how to do that. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to duplicate this artboard here. click on my artboard, click on the one I want, the artboard start tool, click on the thing I want, hold on Option and Shift and keep it in line. So what I want to do is I want to make an area where this picture can fit in, kind of like a frame, but I can move the picture around it, but all this goes away too. So I'll just do that quite easily. Click on the rectangle, and I'm just going to click and drag the area where I want the picture to go in. So this is roughly about here. I'm going to definitely use the bleed, and I'm going to go from red line to red line, the bleed lines, and make that rectangle. There's a rectangle. And now the only way for the clipping mask to work properly is that this rectangle, the thing that the picture is going to go into, the frame, if you will, it has to be in front. So if it's not, you can go to Object, Arrange, Bring it to Front, or select the picture, Object, Arrange, Send it to Back. Now, if I select both of those, there's 3 ways to do this. You can right-click by selecting the frame, this new rectangle you made, plus the picture, right-click and click on Make Clipping Mask, which will make it. You can go to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make, or obviously the shortcut, keyboard shortcut, Command 7. So I'm going to do that, Command 7. And now that picture is inside of this rectangle, which is now its frame. And when I say, well, I still want to move the picture. It's still there. It's inside of the frame. So that's good. So I'm just going to double click. I select the picture inside, and I can just move that picture. I'm holding down Shift, and there it is. There's that waterfall piece that I wanted. I didn't want the left side or the right side. I just wanted that nice waterfall feature, and there I go. I double click, because when you double click on it once, you're in isolation mode. It shows you here, this gray line shows up, and now you're in isolation mode. Just to get back, you could double click anywhere, or just use your arrow and you can get back. And even on your layer panel, it shows you're in isolation mode. So that means you can only play around with this thing that's inside of the frame. Everything else you cannot touch. It's all grayed out. So there we go. Just to get out of isolation mode, double click, and I'm back at it. So once again, I have my bleed line set up here. Perfect. But this one I don't have. Well, I should fix that too. Let me bring this out there. Perfect. Now that is set up as a bleed as well. You know, this one's not correct either. I should set this one, bring this over here. Now, if I want to bring it to the safety kind of area right there, that's fine as well. However, this one I do want to bleed off. The bleed gives you a nice finished clean look when it's edge-to-edge ink coverage. So that's a nice reason why we use it. Some of you might use margins, white margins, that's totally fine. But if you want that bleed look, you can definitely do that. Now the thing with bleed, some printers might actually make it worth a little bit more. Like it costs more to have a bleed, just a little bit. In some situations, with some setups and some dimensions or paper sizes, they might recommend, well, the bleed actually, because of how it's set up, it might actually cost you a little bit more. In some situations, the bleed won't cost you any more at all, which is totally fine. So always speak with your printer and talk with them and let them know what you plan on doing and what the best and hopefully least expensive way it is to do it. So this is how we set up our clipping mask to clean up the area past the bleed, but still make sure it's not touching the artboard like this. Make sure that it actually is extending to the bleed. Okay? So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to look at one last thing here. So when I say that you have that white margin and you're looking good there, that's totally fine and you don't need to actually put a bleed on. But even if, right now I have this little background area here as well. I've actually put a background on here. It's not white, it's actually this blue, but it's transparent. I made it less, it's 10%. Even with a 10% or even a 5% transparency, it's still not white. So I should still extend that to the bleed. Because there is a difference, as you can tell. And when it gets printed, depending on the printer, it actually might look a little even darker. So what you probably want to do, even if it's a 5% or 10% black, depending on, it doesn't matter, you still want to extend it to the bleed. So that's an important thing. So now let's look at something here. Well, we've made our bleed, we've set it up, but now we need to show the printer on our PDF what that's all about. So let me choose one artboard. The one artboard I want to choose is, let's say, the correct one here. And I can see when I click on it, it's artboard 5. So I'm just going to click on artboard 5. I should name these properly too, just to be on the safe side. But generally, I know which one it is because I click on it and it shows it's artboard 5. So this is the one that I want to send to the print. So I'm just going to go to File. And when I make a PDF, I always save a copy instead of save as. So I'm going to make a PDF. But now this time, I have a lot of artboards. And like I said, I want to only use artboard 5. So I can actually choose which artboard I want. I'm going to arrange and say I just want artboard 5. Great. So I'm going to save that. So now what I can do, I'm going to go to my press qualities, my presets. I'm going to choose press quality. That means I'm going to get the best quality. My raster images is not going to lose any, it's not going to have any compression on it. It's perfect as is. I'm going to view the PDF after saving. I'm going to look at my marks and bleeds now. This is the important part now that I'm using a bleed. So all printer marks, that's not necessary. Usually, if a printer asks for all the printer marks, that's fine. But normally, I just show trim marks. And remember, in Illustrator, it's called trim marks. And in InDesign, they're called crop marks. So my trim marks are set, great. But now I also need to show my bleed setting. So if I click on Use Document Bleed Setting, the setting that I already used at the beginning of this file, 0.125 inches, will be there. If for some reason I didn't or I don't, I just want to add it in myself, I can. I just click off of that checkbox in 0.125, and it's just going to follow suit with all the other left, right, and bottom. And I'm just going to say save the PDF. There we go. I save it. And here it is. It opens up, and look what I have. I have my trim marks there on each corner. So what's going to happen is the printer is going to put this up on a sheet, and they're going to cut here all the way down, and they're going to cut here all the way across, cut all the way this way and this way. And what happens, that little piece of paper that comes off where the ink is, it's actually going to get cut off, and I'm going to have edge-to-edge ink coverage. That's how it works. But let me show you some of the issues we have with this PDF. I'm going to do that again. File, save a copy. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to go over top of it, PDF, make sure it's range 5 again, save, replace it, sure. And now I'm going to do the same thing I just did, but I'm going to miss a few steps. Press quality, marks and bleeds. I'm just going to show the trim marks, and I'm not going to show the bleed. Let's see what that looks like. Save PDF. Okay. And here it is. Now look what happened. I have my trim marks, but the bleed is not there. So they would still cut it potentially, cut it across and cut it down, and same with at the bottom. But what's going to happen here is that, yeah, that thin white line that I showed earlier here is probably going to show up because things are going to move a little bit. I didn't give them a little area that just in case things shift, you'd still see some of that ink. So this is definitely not a way to do it either. So what I want to do is, let's do this again. One more time, file, save a copy. And I'm going to show you one more issue is, there we go, replace. I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm not going to put on my trim marks. I'm just going to put on the bleed. Great. Save the PDF, same thing, okay. And here it is. I have a full bled out, but there's no trim marks to show the printer where things are supposed to get cut. Now the printer could figure out 8.5 by 11, but I shouldn't have to leave any guesswork to that. What they should be able to do is see the trim marks, put it up on the page, and trim it off. So what I need to do, obviously one last time to do it properly, and just to show you once again, I'm going to save a copy. I'm going to go, yeah, PDF, range 5, save, replace, and I'm going to say press quality, marks and bleeds, trim marks, and use document bleed settings. Perfect. Save the PDF. Okay. All right, perfect. I got my trim marks. I have the bleed. See this little area? It's going to get cut off. That's exactly what I want to see, what the printer wants to see. Now, realistically, if you made a mistake, the printer more than likely will call you up and say, listen, you got to put the bleeds on there. It's missing or whatever, but they shouldn't have to do that. Professional way to do it, have it done ahead of time, double check your work, and make sure that it's all set up just like that.